Good evening and a warm welcome to this, our 17th annual Leon Levy Lecture. My name is Kai Bird, and I have the honor of serving as the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support for the Biography Center. Specifically, I want to thank her for her recent rather incredible contribution of $10 million to our endowment fund. Plus, she's also pledged up to another $5 million in matching grants. So if any of you have a little change to spare, the Leon Levy Foundation will match your grant up to an amount of $5 million. And if you deign to give us $1 million, we'll name one of the fellowships after you. So you can talk to me after the event. I'll be in the lobby. Please note that our next event will be on Tuesday, March 25th at 6:30, when Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman will be in conversation with Zachary Carter about his timely biography on John Maynard Keynes. I should say that biography is often timely, precisely because it provides profound insights into the human condition. It is no exaggeration to say that we live today in no ordinary times. But it is precisely in these moments of upheaval and disruption that biography becomes particularly relevant. We are reminded that the individual human actor matters, and that biography can explain our world in a way that no other scholarship can. This is true today, but 2,000 years ago, the ancients also recognized the power of biography to explain the chaos around them. For all these reasons, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dame Mary Beard, perhaps the most illustrious biographer of the ancient world. Her intriguing title for this talk is Misleading Lives, the Perils of Ancient Biography. Mary Beard is the author of many acclaimed books on ancient Rome, including most recently Emperor of Rome. A professor emerita at the University of Cambridge, Beard has written some 20 books altogether, including Pompeii, the Life of a Roman Town, SPQR, A History of Ancient Rome, Women in Power, a Manifesto, 12 Caesars, Images of Power from the Ancient World to the Modern. She's also a regular broadcaster and media commentator. She's written and presented television documentaries on history and culture, including 2 acclaimed series, Meet the Romans and Rome, Empire Without Limit. This is a formal lecture, but at Mary's request, we'll try to have time afterwards for 2 or 3 short questions. There are microphones on either side. Now, please join me in welcoming Mary Beard to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai, and thank you, everybody, for coming, one and all. It's great to see you tonight. If anybody here has actually come to hear me talk about the lurid secrets of Roman emperors as a misleading, rather charming, but misleading rogue tweet suggested I was going to talk about a couple of weeks ago, I have to apologize. Emperors do get a couple of kind of cameo appearances this evening, but I'm actually going to be reflecting on a theme that goes much more to the heart of the whole enterprise of biography, which is, in a sense, let me put it bluntly, the impossibility of writing a life in anything like the, quote, standard way of someone who lived 2,000 years ago, what the implications of that impossibility are, and what we might do instead. Now, I realize that it might seem tactless, to say the least, to show up to give a lecture at the Leon Levy Centre for Biography and start to talk about the impossibility of one strand of biography. But my aim is actually a constructive one as well as a critical one, and you're just going to have to be tolerant about the classicist in your midst this evening. To put it another way, this lecture, in a sense, explains why my recent book on Roman emperors was biographical in a way, but was not a series of individual biographies. Right? Now, let me come clean to start with and admit that I myself have actually tried writing a biography in the strict sense of the word only once. So, unlike many people in the room tonight, I am an amateur at biography, or at best an autodidact, right? So again, apologies. But I want to talk about that, my one and only experience of life writing, very briefly, because it sets the scene for the theme that I want to go on to talk about in greater detail. Now, this biographical experiment was only tangentially ancient. I embarked on it in the mid-1990s when I was asked to give a lecture to celebrate the 125th anniversary of my Cambridge College that you see on the slide here, and to speak in particular about one of my most famous predecessors there, the classicist Jane Ellen Harrison, who died in 1928. She'd been the first professional female academic in England, academic in the modern sense of the term academic, and she revolutionized the study of ancient Greek religion. She saw beyond the kind of calm, rational, sort of floaty white exterior that we usually imagine Greek religion being clothed in, to the kind of seething, violent, bloody irrationality underneath that exterior. For that and other reasons, and I think for other reasons as well, she was nicknamed Bloody Jane. Right? The idea was that I, as a female academic, should reflect on a predecessor who'd made it all possible, and as a classicist, I should reflect on the work of a distinguished fellow classicist. Now, I wanted to go beyond the academic books that Harrison had written and the very short memoir of her life that she had written, and beyond a couple of published biographies of her. So in this first and only adventure into biographical research, I went to explore the college's Jane Harrison archive, as it was then called. It was a tremendous privilege, it was very exciting, and a frightful shock. When I saw how disparate and fragmentary the primary material was on which these confident narratives of the biographies were based, really not much more than a few letters, a few minutes of meetings, with some occasional notes and jottings, I quickly realized how fragile those narratives of her life were, even at the very basic level of where she was when, let alone anything to do with her personal, intimate life, which is a whole other story. It's not that the narratives that I'd read were impossible or even implausible reconstructions, but they were constructions and reconstructions nonetheless. A different dive into the material would tell you different stories about her, or different fictions about her, you might say. I was particularly puzzled by the photographs, of which there were quite a few, some with the word Jane scrawled on the back, or J-E-H. Now, in some cases, sure, that identification seemed pretty certain, and the ones I've put up here seem to me fairly certainly her. But in other cases, it could just as well have been happy guesswork or wishful thinking by whoever it was who wrote her name on the back. You know, a bit like my photo album at home, where I've sort of guessed who some of the people were and written that confidently on the back of the photos. You don't have photo albums anymore, but I'm old enough to have a photo album. So the feeling was that I had my biographical subject in mind, but when it came to her, and this was the kind of the void, I wasn't sure I could always recognize her. I was writing about her, I was spending years actually looking at her, but I couldn't always recognize her in her photograph. Now, I know what we'd do now, we'd put it through face recognition software, but in the 1990s, that was beyond me. Right? And I still don't know whether some or all or how many are her and how many aren't. There was also the awkward sense, and it was a slightly dirty feeling, actually, that I was snooping on things and papers that I wasn't meant to be reading. Now, there were no private diaries of her amongst what I read. Strangely, perhaps, I think I wouldn't have minded private diaries quite so much, because I think I'm not the only one to think that all diaries, however private, have always been written for someone to read, whatever the privacy is supposed to be. And there wasn't much about private passions either to make me feel that I was trespassing in that way. It was more the unintended revelation of day-to-day human frailty that might have been better left hidden. For me, the most memorable example came from not Harrison's papers, but some related papers in another college just up the road. They're the papers of one of Harrison's closest friends, Eugenie Sellers. There she is. Who was an archaeologist and for some time deputy director of the British School at Rome. Now, she had largely organised her own archive before her death, and it was a much more complete and systematic collection of papers than Harrison's remnants were. I see now, I think, that Harrison's remnants were actually unusually lacunose for a woman of that prominence at that time. Anyway, one of the big brown envelopes that served as Sellers' filing aids was clearly marked in Sellers' own handwriting, which I could then recognise, quotes, "Letters from important Italians." Right? It turned out to be mostly cardinals and fascist politicians. Now, there was something about the kind of inadvertent, posthumous, undoable, and self-accusatory, self-inculpating display of pathetic snobbery that I wished I'd never seen. And I can never get it out of my mind. Letters from important Italians. Don't ever do it, right? Someone will find it afterwards. Right, there she is. Now, that work, which took me a couple of years, eventually took the form of a book that I called, not very originally, as I now see, The Invention of Jane Harrison. The Invention, right, of Jane Harrison. It came out in 2000, drawing on that sense of her life story being a construct and questions of who it was that was doing the constructing. It was only a little later, I have to say, embarrassingly a bit later, that it became clear to me, autodidact that I was, that many people had reflected on precisely this kind of thing before me, right? I'd ploughed in and I'd kind of discovered it for myself, but I sure wasn't the first to have discovered it. My various reactions to the ambivalences, the fragility, and sometimes the sheer unpleasantness of biography had already been captured, and more sharply, by professionals in the art of biography, as I discovered. I'm thinking here, for example, of Janet Malcolm's famous New Yorker article from 1993, just when I was working on this, on the life and death stories of Sylvia Plath, with its spot-on line about how the voyeurism and busybodyism at the heart of biography are obscured by an apparatus of scholarship. And I thought that's what I'd done. You know, loads of footnotes, but actually it was nosiness that I was doing. It is, she wrote, the medium through which the remaining secrets of the famous dead are taken from them and dumped out in full view of the world. I'm also thinking about the same time of Richard Holmes' 1995 article about the fictionality that's indelibly part of life writing. In his idea, the idea that biography only came about when invention, this is his words, invention formed a love match with the truth. Right? For him, biography was inherently unreliable, complicated, provisional, and perilous. That was something I discovered the hard way, and a bit innocently and ignorantly, honestly, for myself. Now, it's against the background of that toe in the water experience that I had with biography that I want to move to ancient biography. I want to ask what biography is when we turn to the very distant past, not to the life of someone within living memory or not that far from living memory. What are the constraints and intellectual dangers we face in trying to write the life of someone who died more than 2,000 years ago? Now, I shan't really be concerned with the ethics of unearthing the grubby secrets of the men and women of the deep past. In most cases, there are many grubby secrets left to discover. They were lost a very long time ago. But more to the point, I'm afraid, in practice, a person's right to dignity diminishes the further back in time you go, right? It's only when the biographical subject is within touching distance does their privacy or their dignity count for very much. That means Jane Harrison and Sylvia Plath, yes, we have to be bothered about that. Nero, Alexander, and Ashurbanipal, tough luck, really. You can say anything about them and not feel remotely bothered. So I'm not thinking about that kind of the dirtiness, really, the biography. But I shall be concerned with the way our modern accounts of ancient lives present an extreme version, an instructively extreme version of the fragility, the ambivalence, the perilousness, and the unreliability I've just been referring to. And I'm wanting to move on from that to think why that matters, not just to the theory and practice of biographical writing, but also to the way we understand the very notion of what an ancient person was and what the ancient world was like. Right? So, here we have some of the modern biographies of figures from antiquity. You can see them there. I did this in 10 minutes with Google, right? So you could do hundreds more. Alexander the Great, Alcibiades, Agrippina, Augustus, Cleopatra, Caligula, Caesar, Crassus, Julius Caesar, Julia Domna, Horace and Virgil, and there are hundreds more, right? Now, I would be the first to say that there is something to celebrate in this biographical tradition. I'm going to be critical of it, but I'm ambivalent, and I think there's something worth celebrating here. As you can see, there's lots of them. And if you were to go to the ancient history section of Barnes and Noble, you would find, in my experience, roughly 50% of the books in the ancient history section on Barnes and Noble shelves are biographical. Many of them are written by either acknowledged academic experts or by leading literary biographers. They're not rubbish, they're expert, fine-tuned. And they are a huge, in the context of books about the ancient world, they're a huge commercial success. The book industry in general thinks that biographies sell, makes biographies sell, and ancient biographies are part of that popularity. When somebody I know many years ago now, and we've passed his book, and I will not point it out, it was on the previous slide, he went to a literary agent in the UK with a proposal to write a book on the public funding of the arts in the UK over the last 50 years. Now, it was a rather dry and a bit boring subject, but it was something which he knew about, right? He'd been Secretary General of the Arts Council, right? He walked out of the agent's office with a proposal to write a biography of the Roman Republican politician Cicero, about whom he knew a good deal less, right? Though the book did well. And that goes on. You know, you go to a literary agent, as a friend of mine just did, with that really interesting proposal, and they say, "Wouldn't you like to write a biography?" Right? That's the draw. That's what you get pushed to. Now, at this point, looking at these books, it would be easy to carp in ways that I'm not really going to do, and to point out that their subjects are almost entirely the rich, famous, and powerful. There are virtually no biographies of the ordinary in Rome. Now, what you see here is a very rare, just published example called The Remarkable Life and Death, etc., of an ordinary Roman. It's just come out. It turns out, on the basis of a quick look, it's very interesting, but it's actually a biography of his tomb, not of him, right? There simply isn't the documentation, and I'm going to come back to this shortly. It's not the documentation for anything like the scale that underpinned Thatcher Ulrich's Midwife's Tale, which was a huge success on the basis of her diary. It's also the case, you might say, a bit tediously, that a disproportionately large number of Roman emperors feature. And that's partly, as Kai intimated, that's partly because there are what we like to call ancient biographies of them, which underpin the modern biographies, but I'm going to come back to that too in a few minutes. Likewise, it would be easy to observe that the whole subgenre is weighted towards male subjects rather than female, not entirely, but it's weighted that way. And it would be easy to complain at the repetition. The same subjects get re-biographized time after time after time. There have been, in the last 10 years, 10 new biographies of the Emperor Augustus in English alone. And I don't think we need them, actually. I don't actually think we do, right? It would also be easy, in looking at this, to be a bit critical of the overload that you find in these books, of unreliable anecdotage always creeping in. You know, that's the lurid anecdotes, you know, that's what we all like to know about Roman emperors. My favorite example of kind of unreliable anecdotage is one I can't resist sharing, because it's the story, which I'm sure you all know, of the Roman Emperor Caligula and his favourite horse. And it's a story about a Roman emperor that anybody who knows anything about Roman emperors knows. As Suetonius delights in telling us in his 2nd century CE biography of Caligula, the emperor lavished presents on his favourite racehorse. Incitatus, Speedy was his name. He gave Speedy a stall made of marble, an ivory feeding trough, purple blankets, a jewel-encrusted collar, and his own slaves. And this is the most famous bit. He even planned to have the animal elected as consul, the highest-ranking political official in Rome. And this is a clip from a still from the wonderful BBC HBO I, Claudius series, where Caligula is about to announce that the horse is, in his mind, to be consul. Right. Now, hundreds, literally hundreds of modern biographical pages have been spent on Caligula and his horse, right? Particularly on the idea of the consulship, was this the ultimate sign that the emperor was completely barking, right? Or was it a kind of clever joke that misfired? Did he actually really say, you senators are so hopeless, I might as well make my horse a consul as you, which then gets kind of taken literally. What no modern biographer points out is that such stories about emperors and animals were very common indeed. It was an absolute Roman cliché of bad emperors that they had unnaturally close relationships with their horses and treated them like human beings, right? A while later, for example, Lucius Verus is reputed to have given similar purple blankets to his horse, as well as feeding him on nuts and raisins instead of barley. And then Commodus, a bit later still, is supposed to have had his favourite horse's hooves painted with gold nail varnish, right? Now, and there are loads more. Now, it's true that there's nothing quite as extreme as the consulship story, but it's absolutely clear to me that we're not dealing here with individual, real-life, biographical idiosyncrasies, but with shared Roman fantasies about autocratic perversion and excess. In this case, the generic autocrats blurring of the boundary between human and animal. Whether it's true or not, we don't know, I don't care, but the point is, what makes the autocrat? The autocrat, one of the diagnostics is he can't draw the right line between humans and animals. 10 years ago, I would have been very hesitant about saying that, by the way, because there were many British stories about how the Queen treated her corgis, which would get you into trouble if you investigated too far. We were always told that the Queen's corgis ate from silver platters, as if they were kind of at a banquet. I once went to do some, I'm not there by invitation, I went to do some filming, and we were, all of us, the whole crew, were amazed to see this nasty row of plastic dishes lined up in the corridor for the corgis. We thought, it's not true then, they don't eat out of they don't eat out of silver. So those are all the kinds of complaints that you might, in a slightly nerdy way, find fault with, quite a lot of the biographies that I put on the screen. But leaving those aside, I think it's an absolute fact, and Kai, in a sense, suggested this, that many readers have their interest in the ancient world sparked by some of these modern lives. Students are brought into classics this way. They go through the biographical route. And I don't for a minute want to complain about that. But at the same time, I feel we do have to look harder at the kind of biographical phenomenon. And I mean biographical phenomenon because my problem isn't actually with particular faults of particular books. It's with something rather more fundamental at the heart of this subgenre of modern ancient lives, which, at the cost of overgeneralizing, and I am going to be overgeneralizing a bit, I think it's worth challenging, poking at a little bit. And in case you're surprised that not many modern authors' names are mentioned in what follows, that's quite intentional. I'm seeing this as a generic issue, and I will be quoting, but I'm going to anonymize as far as I can. I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody. I'm just trying to shake up the idea of biography a bit. Okay. The bottom line is that the vast majority of these modern ancient lives, either explicitly or implicitly, are trying to offer a systematic account of their subject's journey from birth to death. We might object now, I think, to that very conservative definition of biography. We miss, for example, in these books, any sense of what you often get in modern biography, of the biographer's own role within the book in finding the biographical subject. The biographer in these books is usually hidden. But the task they're setting themselves is a life-to-death account of their subjects. Now, my baseline concern is that that is completely impossible, right? To put it simply, you cannot write a biography in those terms of any single inhabitant of the ancient Greco-Roman world, or you can only pretend to do so. Now, the first thing I want to do in this section of the talk this evening is to explain how we've convinced ourselves that it is possible to do that, because we have, or we buy the books, and to dig a little into the rhetorical and scholarly conventions that underlie it. And then I want to go on to suggest that there is a danger in this modern biographical tradition, for all its plus points, that can have a misleading effect, the misleading lives of my title, on how we understand the ancient world in general. Anyway, at the heart of the problem is the glaringly obvious issue of what the evidence is or is not for these ancient lives that modern writers are trying to reconstruct. Now, I referred at the start of this lecture to my frustration at not quite having enough material to work out what Jane Harrison was doing in the 19th and 20th century. When we come to antiquity, we are dealing with a completely different level of ignorance and uncertainty, way beyond the commonly expressed concerns of modern biographers about the worry of quite how far you really can write a life of someone. There is sometimes a truly jaw-dropping disparity between the surviving ancient evidence and the bulk of the modern biography. At its most extreme, one Greco-Egyptian princess, recently biographized, we've got about 3 pages maximum of vaguely relevant facts about her. She's just been treated to a biography of 300 pages, right? Now, that's an extreme case, and we sometimes do seem to know more than that. And I mentioned the surviving ancient biographies of Roman emperors, right? Suetonius, for example, and his followers, which do appear to underpin the modern biographical tradition. Even there, it's not quite like that. Just to focus on Suetonius, his famous Lives of the 12 Caesars are not biographies in our terms. We call them that, but they're not. For a start, they're quite short, very short, typically 50 paragraphs, right? Some a bit longer, but some quite a lot shorter. They're much more, I think, what we would call profiles. They're newspaper profiles, almost. And it's not just a question of length. They're not ordered often, occasionally there is, but they're not usually ordered according to a chronological narrative, and their focus is highly selective. You can't write a cradle-to-grave life story on the basis of Suetonius or any other ancient biography, because they have zero concern, almost zero concern, with anything that happened before their subject's adulthood. The single best documented person from before Christian antiquity is the Roman politician Cicero, who I mentioned, for whom we not only have a surviving ancient biography, but his own letters, some of his own letters, treatises, speeches, and so forth. But even there, you would be very hard put to it to say anything much about him before he reached the age of 30. Half his lifespan is undocumented. This is where we have to get practical. What does the would-be biographer now do? How do you reconstruct a life from no evidence? Or at best, extremely patchy evidence. How do you go from 3 pages to a fact tome of 300? What do you fill the 297 pages with, right? The answers are surprisingly consistent. And I don't think that I'm overgeneralizing here to say that in this subgenre, more or less every writer, at least at the serious end of the market, writes by roughly the same rules. Now, I should say, to start with, that there's not much fantasy padding or gross embellishment. You know, we're all familiar with the way that bad biographies convert simple statements like X was born on the 29th of July into it was a sweaty, sultry day in midsummer when, after a long labour, X took his first breath to the sound of the twittering cicadas, right? You can all do that. Now, you don't actually find much of that rubbish in these ancient biographies I'm talking about. Something rather more complicated, I think, trickier, in some ways more interesting, is going on. The best way to find an answer to how they get from 200 and how they fill the 297 pages is to get a digital copy of any recent biography of a Greek or Roman and do a global search for the following. May have, would have, might have, could have, and so on. He would have travelled, etc., etc. Now, I guarantee that such grammatical forms occur hundreds of times in these biographies. Now, I have to admit that ancient history is a bit of a would-have kind of subject. And I did try the same digital search on one of my own books, and there were more would-haves than I would have liked, I have to say, but nothing on that scale. And once you've got your eye in here, you find all the subtler variants on that. It's hard to believe that he did not visit Olympia. It is easy to envisage the energetic emperor climbing the Eildon Hills. The odds are that it's a reasonable guess that he surely cannot have been here without, and repeatedly, no doubt, no doubt, no doubt, which of course means exactly the opposite, right? The result, I think, is a kind of obfuscating collusion between the reader and the writer. The reader soon learns to factor out the tenses and the circumlocutions and to read it as straight narrative. They read it as he visited Olympia rather than it is hard to believe that he did not visit Olympia. While the scrupulous scholar-writer uses those same tenses and circumlocutions as an alibi for speculation that verges on outright fiction. It's perfectly okay to make a pledge to the reader in your introduction, I'm quoting here, that I shall claim nothing as fact that I cannot firmly authenticate, when what you really mean is I am allowed unsubstantiated speculation so long as I flag it as conjecture, right? Now, that probably sounds as if I'm alleging bad faith, and I'm not. It's more a question of a desire to squeeze out as much as you can, as scrupulously as you can, in order to tell a story when there isn't actually a story to be told at all. Now, I've called that the may-have, would-have school of life writing. An Oxford colleague of mine, Peter Toneman, made similar points, but I thought with rather more linguistic flair, when he reviewed a 320-page French biography of Vercingetorix, a rebel against Rome, from whose life of probably several decades we know the events from the Roman point of view, when he was fighting Julius Caesar, of just under a year. 52 BC. Toneman, sort of saying the same thing but rather more cleverly than me, notes the use in this book of two curious biographical tenses. The past speculative, as he calls it, that's my may have, Vercingetorix may well have spent some time in, and the past presumptive, a special linguistic tool, he jokes, only used by struggling historical biographers. That's my would have, to quote. The young Vercingetorix would presumably have come to know the skills of the artisans working on his family estate, and he would presumably have gained the experience of a lifestyle intimately linked to nature. Now, as Toneman observes, another convenient feature of the past presumptive is that it is formally irrefutable. How could anyone possibly show that Vercingetorix had not gained experience of a lifestyle close to nature? But there's another layer to it, because you don't go from 3 pages to 300 just by the judicious use of some tenses and a bit of speculation. The past presumptive, the would-have language, is often the launch pad for reams of information, sometimes really good and interesting information, that ups the word count without being remotely biographical in any strict sense. You'll recognize the idiom here. Like most babies of the elite, she would have been handed over to a wet nurse. Q for several pages about ancient breastfeeding, the views of medical theorists, and why rich ancient women didn't often do it. Or, in his teens, he would have started to learn the techniques of public speaking. Q for several more pages on Roman education and the elite school curriculum. Or, if he did go to Egypt, he would, in all likelihood, have stayed in Alexandria. Q for even more pages on the recent archaeology of Alexandria, plus a city plan. Right? It is as if the supposed biographical subject becomes the peg on which to hang a series of mini-essays on different aspects of antiquity. Now, some of this is enticing and informative, and it can be a quite attractive way for structuring a social history of the ancient world, but it's not about the person at all. He or she is as far away as they ever were, even though we're now creeping more to our 300 pages worth, right? What I'm saying is that the book, which has got Nero's mother Agrippina's name on the cover, is not about Agrippina in a way that a biography of Queen Elizabeth II or George Washington is about them, is pretending to be. So what else can you do, and does it matter anyway? So come to finish. I don't have any simple solution, and I am still slightly caught by the residual affection for the life stories of these ancient characters. I'm with Kai there. I want to know the people, right? And I'm being offered the people. On the what else can you do question, I think one answer would be to embrace fictionality a bit more warmly. And I would go back to the words of Richard Holmes that I quoted near the start about the inextricability of biography and invention, words which many modern writers of ancient lives tend to overlook. I'm not just saying make it all up, but I think we need to stop sheltering behind the facts, because there's not enough of them to really shelter behind anyway. The question is not how we keep invention out of these biographies, but on what terms we most responsibly let invention in. Now, there have been a few small-scale attempts along these lines, not all of them hugely successful. I think Peter Stothard's recent biographies of Crassus and Horace point a bit in that direction, as does Alistair Blanchard's biography of the mythical character Hercules. It's worth remembering, though, that the most memorable modern studies of the people of the ancient world are actually branded as fictional. The products very clearly, as Holmes put it, of invention's love match with the truth. I'm thinking of Graves's I, Claudius, Margaret Yourcenar's Hadrian, or Cicero in Robert Harris's Cicero trilogy. Now, the objection to this modern fictional approach is obvious. Is it not, you might say, just an excuse for reinventing the people of antiquity in our own image? Yourcenar's Hadrian is a kind of dreamy mid-20th century mystic with borderline pacifist tendencies. Graves's Claudius is an avuncular Oxbridge Don, and Harris's Cicero is a centrist intellectual Labour Party politician of the kind that Harris himself hung out with when he was a young journalist. That is all true. But that projection is already what is going on anyway in these may have, would have biographies. There is a case, I think, for taking our lead here from antiquity itself in simply a more expansive and varied rhetoric of what life writing is. Because we now tend to define the ancient biographical tradition as pretty narrowly clustered around Suetonius, Plutarch, and their famous real men. But antiquity is distinguished by a wide range of experiments in capturing, in writing, lives that were real, that were fictional, and semi-fictional. And they were lives. The word biography doesn't get used, so far as we know, till the 6th century CE. They're writing, literally writing lives. And the key strand of ancient fictional biography, that sort of sense that you might really want to write about someone who doesn't actually quite exist, gives us some of the most revealing lives there are from antiquity. The only ancient biography of a slave, for example, the life of Aesop, is almost entirely fictional. So is the 2nd century CE quasi-biography by Lucian of his almost certainly invented philosophical teacher, Demonax. I mean, what I suppose I'm trying to say is that ancient writers are as inventive in biographical form as the most radical modern biographers. And ancient writers are a lot more inventive than people now who try to write about ancient people, right? And we might learn from them, I think. To finish with, though, does it matter? Does any of this matter? At this point, I think we have to take a step back and recognize that one of the most important challenges for anyone studying the Greeks and Romans is to face the big ask. Were these people like us? How far can you understand a Greek person or a Roman person in our terms? Now, part of the answer to that is very simply, yes, they were like us. They made love, they slept, they got sick, they were human beings, and in part, we now have inherited our version of what it is to be a human from them, right? But I always bridle when I hear people say, as they often do, gosh, weren't they just like us? Because, of course, they were completely fundamentally different. They were weirdly alien, with a completely different idea of what a human being was. They saw the workings of the body differently. They defined their geographical place in the world differently. Most of them didn't even know very clearly what they looked like, because like most people in Europe until the early modern period, they didn't have mirrors, right? Now, I complained earlier about not being able to recognize Jane Harrison in her photos. It's worth trying to imagine what it would be like not to be able to recognize yourself. Right? That's the world we're in. And there's some shocking differences. We know that some Romans saw no problem with literally throwing away newborn babies that they didn't want. That was not because they were cruel, although in our terms they certainly were, but because the baby was not deemed to be a human person until it had been born and accepted as human by its father. Can we possibly imagine a world in which infanticide was more like contraception than it was like murder? How would that change what we thought a human being was? So, as you'll have guessed, my further qualms about these biographies come down to the way that they project us back onto antiquity as strongly as any novel does. They package these ancient people as if they were, broadly speaking, modern, with just a few specific identifiable differences, from wet nurses to rhetorical education, which can easily be explained and bulk up the word count. The chapter headings, for a start, are often a giveaway. A boyhood in Rome, the young officer, an active old age. As to the subtitles that lurk after the headline names, Alcibiades, playboy, general, traitor. In what sense, for heaven's sake, was a 5th century BCE Athenian a playboy? And what does labeling him as that conceal from us? And then there are the may-have speculations about mental state. Take this as an observation of the same Greco-Egyptian princess I've mentioned. She was not able to spend much time with either of her parents, but it's unlikely she was ever lonely. Now, anodyne enough, in a way, but the fact is we have absolutely no idea what loneliness meant 2,000 years ago, what the experience of being on your own was, how you'd even say, in Latin, I'm lonely, right? I can't. And I suppose I was guilty of some modernizing myself when I complained that ancient biographies weren't interested in childhood and the youth of their subjects, as if I were a bit irritated that they didn't share my concerns, when I should have been thinking of the differences that hung on a tradition of life when they weren't bothered with childhood, when childhood didn't count. So for me, the pressing biographical problem is how to write about the people in the deep past that captures their radical alienness as well as their sameness. How can biography expose the in part impossible otherness of these people while still making sense to us, right? Because we've got to read the stuff. Where should we put the boundary between the slick, modernizing but approachable comparison? And I know that I've used plenty of those in my time, far worse, I confess, than Playboy. The boundary between that and the obligation to defend the difference of the people in the past. I'm not sure I know the answer, but this really picks up what Kai said. Though I've been critical of this biographical enterprise in what I've said in the last 50 minutes, I also think that biography has to be one of the most puzzling, privileged, and important terrains in which we can debate how the past is different from the present. My very last thought is a bit less flippant than it might appear at first hearing. Sometimes when I think about Greek and Roman biographies, I see a spectrum of life writing, ranging at one end from a modern biography of, let's say, a recent president or prime minister. The other end of this spectrum, I see a biography of a dog, right? with all the impossible contradictions of form, consciousness, interiority, and definition that entails. Somebody's now going to tell me they know a very good biography of a dog, but I don't. What I find myself wondering is where on that spectrum between the biography of Donald Trump and the biography of a dog we put the Greeks and Romans. And I don't know the answer to that, but I know it's a lot harder than writing a biography of Jane Harrison. Thank you very much.